It will not be a questioning on whether an authentic art practice exists. Though, discussing the theme, I stumbled on notions that conscious or unconsciously have an influence in my art practice. Such as, how do all the different parts of a person come into play when working? How do they create a momentary whole, or mainly show process? Conscious decisions, before I see, I know. Corporal memory, and physical possibilities in the painter's hand. I would like to read a quote from Maurice Merleau-Ponty before going to introducing our speakers. "The painter takes his body with him," says Valerie. "Indeed, we cannot imagine how a mind could paint. It's by lending his world to the artist changes the world into paintings. It's by lending his body to the world that the artist changes the world into paintings. To understand this transubstantiation, we must go back to the working, actual body. Not the body as a chunk of space or a bundle of functions, but that body which is an intertwining of vision and movement." I hope, and I'm curious, if this topic will lead to a discussion on how we are wired towards our own practice. I would like to introduce to you our speakers for this talk. Camille van Winkel, art historian and critic. Giorgos Kontis, artist and researching the notion of authenticity in the act of painting. And Marleen Hartjes, artist, independent curator, and one of the moderators at Museum de Pont. I will now give the word to Marleen. Thank you.
Welcome, welcome. Good to see you all. I would like to introduce to you the first speaker because we have a short amount of time and we want to talk to you about a lot of things. So I want to give Joris the opportunity.
Thank you, Marleen. Thank you, Janu. I have prepared a presentation on the topic. I would like to start by saying a few words on why I have become intrigued and fascinated by this topic, and by trying to shortly explain what the complex notion of authenticity is. My concern and contemplation on the notion of authenticity occurred through my work in what I like to call a natural way. I would say that it derived through my concern on notions as sincerity and honesty, and from my need to search for its profounds, for a sort of an underlying essence, as also from my questioning on whether my work becomes a plain repetition of itself, or even a repetition of something that has pre-existed before and besides it. What Michel Foucault calls the anonymity of a murmur makes me question when and whether I become the author of my work, or I'm just being a part of a sequence of attitudes and people. This personal inquiry seemed in its beginning rather obsolete, though I felt challenged to deal with it in terms of today, and mainly regarding the role of the artist, as also regarding what can be seen as art practice process in painting today. In the case of an artwork, authenticity is mainly applied as a distinction between the genuine work and its forgery, or between the original and its copies. In this way, it is used to evince the relationship between the work and the artist, or to verify that the work is indeed made by the artist himself, as if handmade means necessarily authentic. Although this allegation may bear a dose of truth, it is quite narrow and simplified for such a complex matter, and can easily mislead us to vague conclusions as every work that is made by the artist himself is automatically authentic, or every work that is not made by the artist himself goes immediately out of the sphere of authenticity. In this painting, in this way, the painting of Morandi is authentic. But this one is also authentic. Are they the same? Is there any difference? This is what I like to inquire, the differences. And to move a step further, what is happening with the erased de Kooning drawing of Robert Rauschenberg or the work of Sol Levitt. In this way, I question myself. In my art practice, I would say that I have a direct relationship with the surface I work on, even a physical one, through the use of my bare hands and fingers. Does this, as a mere fact, automatically establish the notion of authenticity in my work? It is a question to which I would rather answer no. The question on the authenticity should thus become a question on the original, genuine work itself. It should rather change from being a specific question in a narrow sense to something broader, to what the issue of authenticity actually is. A philosophical contemplation on a work of art regarding its own self, regarding its substance, regarding a sense of an underlying truth that it might bear. The use of the notion of authenticity is mainly focused on two notions, on the one of origin and on the one of truth. We use the term authenticity or the adjective authentic when we, for instance, want to evidence that something comes indeed from where it is supposed to come, or is in fact what it is supposed to be. Authenticity acts as a highlight, namely, of the truth of a thing, whether this truth refers to its origin or to its substance. The etymology of the word derives from authentis, aftos for self, and hentis for doer, being, which means one acting on one's own authority. In this way, the question of authenticity becomes a question on the act, on the making of the work, and simultaneously becomes a contemplation on one's own authority upon this act. In the case of painting, it becomes a question on the act of painting, besides any plain allegation of the handsmade, as previously mentioned. And a question on when and whether the painter becomes the author of it, or otherwise acts on his own authority. Thus, then, authenticity becomes in this way necessarily linked to the idea of the author, and should any question on authenticity have been cast away along with the death of the author? Is the questioning on authenticity in this way a residue of the past that cannot have any relevance to our time? Is this sort of a myth and a remnant of what Camille van Winkel calls the romantic cult? Can the doer, the maker, be seen in this way in a different context rather than the one of the author? Could we have a different view on what can be an author today besides the hyper-individual artist? At that point, I would like to put on hold this question and try to shortly form a view on what seems to be going on with painting today, and what can be seen as the act of painting today. For this purpose, I would like to take a look with you on some extracts of statements of three recent major exhibitions. The first one is The Painter from the Walker Art Center. I'm reading an extract of the statement. It also considers the ever-shifting role of the painter in contemporary art and culture, which remains as fluid as the medium itself. Here, new languages of abstraction and eccentric methods of making are freely pursued, crossing paths with sculpture, poetry, film, music, performance, design, publishing, craft, and fashion. Thus, painting becomes a conduit, a way to make contact beyond the close frame of their formal invention. The second one is from Why Painting Now in the city of Vienna. According to the title, Why Painting Now? 20 international curators have developed different approaches that show that the media is constantly redefining itself by permanently verifying and enlarging its opportunities. Hence, why painting now does not stand for the simple contemplation of panel paintings, but for a wider concept of painting that interacts with other media, including installations, photography, video and performance, thus demonstrating that painting has long become part of the pictorial world, beyond the mere painted canvas, also in terms of its material qualities. The third and last one is from Painting Forever in Berlin. The individual and group presentations of the 4 exhibition formats of Painting Forever will demonstrate various approaches to the medium. Installation-based and location-specific approaches will play a role, as will classical concepts of painting. The exhibitions are based on various artistic and curatorial positions, and despite their diversity, all address the question of what painting can and wants to be today. This was the end of the third and last extract. Well, the redefinition of painting, which is either way an ongoing process, seems to have been intensified in the last years. Although the repetition of terms as redefinition or the attitude of the medium to question and criticize itself seem to make a relation to a modernist spirit, the general attitude marks significant differences. In contrast with the Greenberg quote, painting is nowadays not afraid to subvert itself and to question itself beyond its borders, or besides itself, as David Josselet names it. This is applied both to the work and to the artist himself, whose role is significantly altered. The act of painting can in this way be seen as an activity besides the dominant character of making or producing. It can be seen, for instance, as transition or as a highly personalized semiotic activity. The role of the painter relatively changes from the creator, the maker, the producer, to an activity which himself needs to find or even to invent. And this may be consequently applied on a form or through a form which again needs to be invented or selected amongst options that are expanding far away from the traditional realm of painting. In this environment of seemingly endless ways and possibilities, the act of painting becomes a matter of decisions. Decisions and exclusions on which way will be followed and which not, which form or process will be used, and which activity will be. The doer, the maker, becomes in this way the conductor, even of his own self, and even of elements besides his own self. The producer becomes the director, or even the DJ, as Nicolas Bourriot says. Then how can the notion of authenticity be questioned within these terms? Since handmade does not necessarily lead to authenticity, and the opposite, all different activities, processes and ways become in a sense legitimized. In this way, authenticity is not a question on the means that are used, but on how, through the decisions and the processes, is one acting on one's own authority. I believe that along with the expanded form of painting comes the expanded form of the artist. Along with painting beside itself may come the artist beside himself or herself, as through a notion of the author, not as the hyper-individual, but rather through the awareness of being a part of a bigger whole and being a multi-layered construction. Thank you.
Yes, I would like to thank Giorgos for his text on authenticity in the act of painting. Please keep your questions a little bit longer because I want to give the microphone to Camille because he has a statement as well and he will explain everything about it. And afterwards there is time to ask some questions and get in the talk with each other about this subject. Okay. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you for coming. Thanks for the invitation. Well, I have no slides, but just leave this one on. My statement is about authenticity, but it takes a kind of a small detour. What is problematic about painting? One problem of painting is, I think, that the medium gives its practitioners the impression that every new work starts with a clean slate. The empty canvas in front of them suggests that before they actually start applying paint, there is nothing. No remainders of history, no leftovers, no inherited formats, no conventions and habits, no predecessors, no projections into the future, no interference from outside, nothing. Just an empty field waiting for the painter to start asserting him or herself. The perfect receptacle for an individual identity. Of course, there is no such thing as a clean slate. But in the contemporary context, painting is the medium in which this false notion persists. It is impossible to be an artist, to produce works of art without appropriating something somehow. To believe that artists can start with a blank slate is a romantic fantasy. I'm not saying that all artists in their tendency to appropriate things are therefore thieves. That would be too moralistic, that would be misplaced. All artists inherit from the past. They receive a tradition, they borrow, they copy, and yes, sometimes they steal. They may reject the tradition, but in the end the tradition, or some tradition, will incorporate them anyway. They may refuse to accept the inheritance, but explicitly rejecting something inherited is just another way of keeping it present and alive. Nothing will change the fact that artists are in debt from day one. They owe. What they owe and how they owe, what they owe and to whom they owe it may not be immediately clear, but that is a different issue. The debt is unmistakable. It is a heavy load that can be felt, a burden that artists drag along with them. A lot of confusion arises out of this. Artists may react in different ways to their predicament. There is this artist, let's call him X. X strongly and obsessively denies that he is in debt. He thinks he doesn't owe anything to anyone. He's clearly and completely in denial. It's quite pathetic. He sits in his studio and nothing else interests him. He feels he has no obligations to anyone. He does what he thinks is right. He has no doubts. He's unaware that he's feeding on recent or not so recent chapters from the history of art. But he continues doing his thing anyway. And he doesn't understand why he has so little success. There's this other artist, let's call him Y. I'm using the male form, but of course, it could be also a female artist. Let's call him Y. In order to pay back his debt, the debt that he's somehow fully aware of, this artist puts himself in the service of society. He may be servile and obsequious, crawling like a worm to get his proposals accepted by the majority of artistically uninformed fellow citizens. Or he may be arrogant like hell, pushing the point that his work benefits society, that people would be stupid to reject his services. Of course, the arrogance is only a cover-up, a compensation for the fact that he is indebted, that he owes everything to some entity too big for him to fathom. Just like X, his colleague, he doesn't understand why he has little success. Why am I saying this? Because the fiction of the clean slate is closely connected to the idea of authenticity. Authenticity is the conviction that you don't owe anything to anybody. Authenticity is not a property of the object or the work of art. It is something we may believe in, something we may want to believe in. It is a fantasy, a desire projected onto the object. Authenticity is not a useful or critically relevant concept, at least not anymore. It is a figment of the imagination. It is part of the way people talk about art. It expresses an expectation on the part of the viewer, the audience, the art community. It comes out of the legacy of Romanticism, and as such, it is a very real thing, with real effects. Authenticity exists, but not in the work of art, only in your mind. Thanks.
You can stay there. I want to re-invite Giorgos to the stage so that we can actually continue this talk. If you can sit somewhere in the middle, I will just sit a bit aside. Okay, this last statement made me write very, very fast several questions about what you were saying, Camille. But I'm actually quite curious about what Giorgos thinks and feels about what Camille just said.
Well, in our first meeting, I remember that you told me that the notion of authenticity is out of date. The notion of authenticity is not a question of today. In a sense, it belongs, as you said now, to the myth. I would say that this is the reason why I have also become intrigued by questioning that, by the challenge to research that through my work. I mean, through the making, through all these gestural marks, and through the direct relationship. It feels like it's not enough. It feels like the answer to that is like, who is doing that? It's the artist that is doing that, and at the same time, it's not enough. But then the question comes: can we search for something? Is there something related to authenticity? And then, in the terms of today, besides this hyper-individual form of artist, can we question that in terms of this multi-layered construction, which I think the artist is today? In the myth of artisthood, you name 3 ingredients of the artist: the romantic heritage, we might say, the critical attitude. Would you say that through a construction like that, we could think of a term of authenticity in a wider concept, in a wider sense? And this, yeah.
Well, yeah, well, I don't know. Maybe the myth of artisthood, as I write about it in the essay, is like a hybrid. It's like a mix of different ingredients. One element is indeed comes out of the Romantic legacy, notions of originality, the essence of art. The art is a kind of mission towards some unreachable spiritual aim, some point on the horizon. Yeah. I don't know how you can make these. I mean, these things, of course, as I tried to explain in my introduction, these things are still here. They're still part of the way we look at art. But you need to. I think in terms of critical discourse, I don't think it can be easily appropriated for today. I don't think it can be very useful unless you give a definition that is different, that somehow kind of gets rid of these legacy, or that kind of is more appropriate for the situation today. But I'm not sure I would use the term then of authenticity.
also in the myth of artisthood, you say that those things are still here, of course, as a burden, but at the same time we can't get rid of them because then it would be maybe problematic. Yes, you name them as ingredients in the essay, and as also similar ingredients create the sandwich of the academic discourse that you described in your lecture at the Rietveld Academy. Through that is how I want to see. I want to research the notion of authenticity, not through this very strict and stiff concept of this hyper-ego, of this hyper-individual, but through a layered construction, through something similar to a sandwich you referred. At the same time, as you said now, authenticity automatically leads us to a sense of this underlying truth, which again brings in mind something heavy, something very romantic. At the same time, I don't want to use that in this sense, in the sense that leads immediately, automatically to spirituality, to theosophy. I think it can be seen through a context which is more close to today, to now. Last June in the symposium at Extra Large Painting exhibition in the dock of Rotterdam, where you spoke about the work of Klaas Kloosterboer. Another participating artist was Chris Martin. So Chris Martin was polite enough to give me a short interview, and we talked about this sense, about how can we approach those notions, like this underlying truth and this spirituality and this theosophy. And he told me something which I find very interesting. Like, you can't see them without this heaviness. You can't see them without all this religious hue that they may bear. And by talking about his art practice, he said, you can do that, you can reach that through having fun or something similar. And he gave a very interesting example on the painting of Polke, the one whose title is Higher Power Command paint the upper right corner black. In a sense, there is a higher power, there is something that might be similar to what was called spirituality or something, but we get to that through a different view, not through the heaviness, but through something different.
How do you see that, Camille?
Yeah, well, the cult of the artist, the romantic cult of the artist, is not. That's not the only ingredient of contemporary art discourse. So it is already a mixed discourse. The contemporary art discourse is a mix of modernist elements, romantic elements, also even Beaux-Arts elements. So yeah. So I'm not saying that if you use a concept like this, you automatically go back to romantic times or something. It is contemporary discourse, but it's part of a hybrid kind of discourse that you somehow have to use to express yourself. Even I have to. I'm not an exception. And you can, of course, add to that discourse. It's like a Tower of Babel that you can add your own little balcony or level to. But if you want, I still haven't really heard a new definition of authenticity from Giorgos. So it's not so much different. There's not so many things I can say about it.
Could you explain a bit what you think is slightly new about your approach to this question?
New. First of all, my ambition, my desire is not to reach a certain conclusion. A certain conclusion is not to get to a definition. I think that this is not possible, and at the same time, it's not what I'm interested in. what I'm interested in is to question it and to see whether we can deal with it, whether we can cope with it today, or if it is still something as a burden from the past. What becomes problematic in this contemplation is this idea of the author. The author that has died 50 years ago, 40 years ago, and this makes things very interesting. How can we deal with that, and how can we speak about the notion of the author? Camille, in the regime of visibility, gives a very extensive insight in the work of Cindy Sherman, where you use quotes of critics on her work. That's what differentiates her from, let's say, Kate Moss, that you make the comparison, is that she becomes in charge of what she does. And through that she becomes the author of what she does, through consciousness or through autonomous and critical condition. Of course, at the end, you kind of denounce that and you say that it is a myth and we cannot be the authors of our life. I wanted to ask you if you believe that, of course, we can't. There's no such thing as this original act, as this original making, but if you believe that through notions and acts as consciousness, awareness, and conducting or DJing, we can create this new type of author.
Sorry, but I don't understand. A new type of author of our lives? Because author of what? What kind of authorship are you talking about?
Regarding the work, not of our lives. Or if you believe that it is completely denounced.
Well, in this more recent text that you referred to, which was is based on a lecture I did at Rietveld, I kind of analyzed it's kind of an update of this three-parted model of the myth of artisthood. So I explain how the sandwich of artistic academic discourse is built up of three layers. The first layer being the romantic cult of the artist. The second layer is the layer of post-structuralism. So you have the death of the author that you referred to. So, which is of course a correction on this more romantic myth. The death of the author, it's kind of the decentering of the subject. There's no, the autonomous willpower of the author is kind of deconstructed. Everything is transcribed. Any creative act is always based on creative acts that precede it, etc. So the whole myth of originality, of creative willpower is kind of deconstructed. But that, of course, is problematic, because then how do you talk about the agency of the artist? How can you still talk about an artist having a kind of artistic will, having a position, having an active position in the cultural field? And so there, I bring in the third layer of the sandwich, which is the legacy of cultural studies, which is kind of a very academic layer of the sandwich. It's the most recent layer also, and it kind of makes it possible to talk about culture in terms of more collective agency. So not so much the individual, but more classes, a social class, a group. You talk about agency in terms of gender, in terms of economic power, in terms of ethnicity, etc. So certain groups are identified that have a collective agency and a collective identity. So these three layers are still present in the way we talk about art today, I think. It kind of explains some of the complexities and hybridities and also contradictions in a lot of the contemporary art discourse. Yeah, so the death of the author has been dealt with in a way already in this discourse.
So it is in a way still in question. We don't completely denounce it. Of course, two types of questions. In a way, I see the. Yeah.
I have to say, if there are any questions from the audience, you just raise your hands and I will mix you somewhere into this conversation. Because I was wondering, Camille, you were talking about authenticity in your statement, but when you were saying authenticity, I had the feeling it can be replaced by the word autonomy, because it has the same. How do you think about that? Is it replaceable by it, or what has autonomy to do with authenticity?
Autonomy is it's more of a modernist word, I think, but I think for me it's a more interesting word than authenticity today, at least, given the political pressure that is being put onto the art as a whole, or an individual artist. I think it is important. For me, autonomy means that basically the rules, the laws, the criteria of art are developed within art itself. Not necessarily by the individual artist, but it's also more of a collective thing, but within the art itself. That's something that the art world itself has maybe neglected a little bit in the last decade or so, which has allowed also politicians to kind of jump in, and if the art world itself is already saying that art should be measured in terms of social relevance and etc., then it's very easy for politicians of the more populist kind to jump in and to cut, you could almost say, to sanction artists who refuse to be socially relevant in a kind of clear-cut way. So that's why I think the notion of autonomy is something that should be reconsidered, although it's also a problematic notion, of course, but it should be reconsidered and put on the agenda, given the context and the situation of today.
Yeah, because in your text you also refer to the success of artist number X and Y. What has success to do with authenticity?
Nothing. It was just my way of kind of creating a kind of sketching a kind of field where different artists' attitudes are kind of can be connected to this idea or this denial of the idea of having a kind of depth to something that's bigger than your own identity.
Okay.
But if you talk about painting in particular, I thought this idea that when you see somebody who starts to paint, he makes a canvas, he frames it. I mean, he puts it on a stretcher, he puts it on his easel or on the wall, whatever, and there you have it. It's the clean slate. That's the tabula rasa. There's nothing yet. You can start. I think that's somehow kind of characteristic for the attitude of not all painters, but maybe painting as a medium in itself. It's a suggestion that you can start afresh, that there's nothing before you actually put the first stroke of paint. So that was just something I wanted to put forward. So it's particularly for this medium of painting, that's kind of problematic, I think.
Yeah, if you see the blank canvas as a clean slate, of course it can be problematic. Only to use this surface is a decision. Only to stretch the canvas, only to use canvas is a decision, and to stretch it on the stretching bars is something much more than just the beginning of the work. all of these function as signs, as in a kind of a semiotic discourse, and you need to be aware of that. There is no such thing as a clean slate. It's a clean slate.
Yeah, okay, but maybe people who decide to become a painter. I mean, I don't want to say negative things about painting in general, but maybe people are attracted to the medium and who decide to become a painter. Maybe that's the kind of people who like to believe in this idea of a clean slate. Could that be possible?
Yes, I think it can be possible. It's because I believe because of the directness with the material itself, and because of this physical relationship, and this is what triggered me also the question: do I do that? Do I do this original, let's say, gesture? No, I don't do that.
Of course, and the most interesting painters, I mean, you already mentioned Polker, but there's many examples. The most interesting painters, of course, reject this idea of a clean slate, and they kind of show that it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
I think, because I see that the time is already there for us to round up a bit, I see there are some painters in the audience, and I would like to know how they see they act in their own paintings. Is there someone who wants to react on that? Maybe Joost, how do you see the actual working on the canvas as the most important thing, or do you think something else is more important?
Well, the idea of the clean slate is really also an issue in my work, and it's really a struggle between if it's an original idea or if I'm connected in some sort of system or traditional way of seeing painting. So, but it's also a notion, you were talking about the canvas and the structure, and that's also a very fixed idea. And there's also a lot of possibilities in where you paint on. Maybe it's also. I don't think that all hustles of the whole discussion, but.
Yeah.
There is a fixation on this. Yeah,
thanks.
Interesting.
Thanks a lot for saying that. I would like to thank Giorgos, and I would like to thank Camille and Janu for inviting us. I think this talk emerged a lot more questions than we came into here today. I think we answered less questions. I think there popped up a lot more new questions about the authenticity of the act in painting. But I think for some reason, I think what you say, like there was a small sentence you said, that the reason artists now, painters now, choose to use painting as a medium, when you have all these media to choose from, like video or installations or whatever, I think when you choose the medium painting, you immediately attract the act of doing it. That's a very important thing when you become a painter nowadays. So again, I would like to thank my guests, and I would have a super nice day today. Thanks.